So I'm here with Sinziana Ravini, who is a psychoanalyst and a writer and an art critic, and also now a fiction writer with a new novel coming out next year, tentatively called Desire. But we're not going to talk about the novel now, but a new book coming out at the Université de France in the beginning of next year called The Psychonautes, which is a book on psychoanalysis and art. And it has, I would like to begin by saying this, it has a kind of peculiar structure, because it moves almost like jumping on ice flakes from one topic to another, from theory to practice to artworks to philosophical theories, and it's a kind of flow that goes on in the text. And in the introduction you describe this as almost like a psychoanalytic process, where you're on the couch and you have these free associations. So you're somehow displaying yourself, you're displaying your own flow of associations. And I mean, strangely enough, and this is my first question, is that when you're doing that, you're acting the patient, in some sense. And it positions me as a reader, as your analyst. And in that sense, I would have to direct back to you the question which Lacan poses, que veux? What do you want? What is your desire?
Wow. If I knew it, I think I wouldn't have written this book.
No.
Usually, I think that there are two theories. One of them is that we actually can't know our hidden desires because the hidden object of desires is always foreclosed.
Yeah.
Claims certain psychologists. The other part of this, the field of thinkers think that actually you can know your true inner desire, and I actually tend to believe that you can know it, but we just don't have enough courage to express it to ourselves, or even recognize it for ourselves. But if I knew it, which I perhaps don't, I don't think I would tell it. I would tell you behind the scenes.
Yeah, behind the scenes. Yeah. But I'm interesting because you're setting up this exchange between psychoanalysis and art, and I think for a lot of people, who would criticize psychoanalysis, especially if they come through Freud, they will say that psychoanalysis always places art in a kind of passive role. It's caught up in the imaginary, and Freud writes about art. He uses art like the Oedipus complex and other things, but he's not really interested in art. I would say not. He uses art, but he
used the Sophocles. Sophocles famous drama for the Oedipus complex.
Really. He doesn't give it an agency, but you do that. For you, I think somehow. One of the way Marisud book is that it somehow places works and theories on the same level, and there's an exchange going back and forth. How do you perceive that exchange between psychoanalysis and art?
Well, I think that Freud and Lacan said that the artist always is the one who precedes psychoanalysis, and Freud did use Sophocles in order to invent the concept of Oedipus complex. It was a theatre piece written by Sophocles, and the same thing with Lacan, the graphic of desire. He used Cazotte's famous novel called The Devil in Love. So I think that art is always what escapes the subject, the knowing subject, but also makes us entertain the mystery around the art object. And Lacan says that the analyst is le sujet supposé savoir. But usually in art theory, when we do art theory, when we write about art, we are forgetting about this golden rule that we don't know what we're talking about. So, and for me, it's a fiction that has to be deconstructed. Yeah. It has to be, and that's why I also try to work with my what I call sometimes Achilles heel. And with my zones of misunderstandings, and so it's an inquiry on what I don't understand about art.
What I was getting at somehow that you give, as you said, you give artworks an agency. And when you said earlier, that it's difficult to know your desire, because in some sense, I don't know if you could, I don't know what that would mean if you would know your desire. But artworks have a certain way of probing into that dimension. I think it's very interesting because it somehow sets up this. There's a very nice essay, I don't think you quoted it, by Jean-François Lyotard, called Freud According to Cézanne, Freud selon Cézanne. And it's in his book Dispositif Pulsionnaire from the early 70s. And he says that psychoanalysis, and he's very critical of traditional psychoanalysis. He says that it always places artworks in the imaginary. They are like removed from reality, and they are like inert objects onto which analysis projects his concepts. But we have to think otherwise. We have to think inversely. We have to think Freud according to Cézanne. What does Cézanne say about Freud? Can artworks respond to theory and perhaps even displace theory? I don't know if you thought about this, response question thing.
Well, there are some artists that actually use theory, almost like, how should I call it, pâte à modeler in French.
Yeah.
I don't know how you say it in English, but almost like, tools, like a box of tools, and they change their substance, and they also make fun of the theory as such. But then I think that Lawrence Wiener said it very well, that theory to artists is like, how do you call it in French, ornithology.
It's actually Barnett Newman,
It's Barnett Newman?
Yeah,
sorry, I thought it was Lawrence Wiener.
It could have been Lawrence Wiener, but it's actually, in fact, Barnett Newman. He says
it's
that
like ornithology for birds.
Art history is to artists like ornithology is to birds.
Exactly.
But you are also an ornithologist because you are a psychoanalyst as well. How do these? You also teach art theory both in Sweden and in France. You also How do you see those two professional roles? Are they different?
Well, I see our relation to the art objects as a symptom. I was terrified by some artworks that also mesmerized me. First artwork that really, really marked me was Faust by Goethe opera piece in Bucharest when I was 4 or 5 years old. I was so fascinated by this old man at the end of his life who wanted to commit suicide and then gets the chance to relive his life all over again because of Mephisto, who comes in and said, look at me, you have, passé à côté, as the Frenchmen say, you have studied so much, yet you know nothing. So, and I was, of course I didn't understand the dimensions of the work when I was 5 years old, but that really marked me. And with my students, what I asked them as essay at the end is choose one work, one art piece, film or book or anything that has truly marked you, and try to analyze it and try to understand why, and use your affects. In French philosophy, as you know, it has been so rationalistic, so I think we have to go back to the affects and write about how works affect us. So for me it's also how should I say, a wish to show how the movement of thought, of thinking as such, all the dimensions of a journey. Philosophy is always a journey, and what are the ups and downs of a quest. So that's why I actually used Joseph Campbell's very kitschy theory book called Hero with 1,000 Faces, that has been used by a lot of filmmakers, American filmmakers, in order to create a dramaturgy. I of course didn't use his 12 specific turning points in a journey. I invented my own, only to show that we always tell a story through art.
But you're saying that as your students to pick one particular work that affected you, and that's also the kind of advice you give to the reader at the end. You say that.
That's true.
I guess this is also how the book began. Does it begin from the experience of artworks or from the concept of psychoanalysis?
It actually has several beginnings. One of them is when I was doing an exhibition about the mother in the art. And I actually reenacted, if you can say so, or anyway, created a cabinet, a Freudian cabinet, where the visitors could do an analysis for 45 minutes, a Freudian one, and choose one work that had really touched them. And then I discovered, that was 10 years ago. 10 years ago, I was not an analyst, but it was how wonderful it was to just sit down and listen to the visitors' free associations. And that's when I decided to become an analyst one day. And then another beginning is when I started really teaching without having any, notes anymore. Because teaching, I don't know what you think, teaching for me and doing an analysis, lying on the couch, is pretty much the same thing. Because you get how do you say, överraskad? You get
surprised.
Surprised about what you actually think when you speak. Doesn't it happen to you too?
Well, I gave up using notes like 15 years ago. First you're nervous because you have to have a written text, and then get more secure and you start talking yourself. There's a certain moment of surprise when you're teaching. It can't be too much surprise. No, but it's true. I mean, teaching is an experience. It's a kind of journey, and
it's a journey.
And sometimes you're saying things that you really don't know what they are.
Exactly.
I wanted to ask you. I mean, you used a lot of concepts. We encountered the real or the symbolic and the imaginary and many other concepts in psychoanalysis. There's a theme that surfaces occasionally, but it's not really explicit. I mean, this is the question of the sexual difference. Because I know a lot of artists and critics, specifically, as it were, feminist critics, have of course objected to psychoanalysis because it's male and it's the phallus and all these things, and of course all of these caused rifts also in the Lacanian school, in the 80s. So I was wondering, how do you see the gender dimension of psychoanalysis? Is it, as Lacan would say, it is a male narrative from Freud onwards, but are you trying to shift that, or how do you negotiate that kind of tradition?
Well, in a way, I actually disrespect the way one writes about art. I mean, trying to tell a story, trying to go against the subject supposed to know. I mean, I've always tried to make fun of psychoanalysis. I even invented a double, which I brought in psychoanalysis when I wrote my novel, because I think that it is very phallocentric and it is very, moralistic, more than ever, especially when it comes to liquid identities and so on. And also the way today people say, oh, the society it's really this how do you say decomposition is decomposing itself because there is the foreclosure of the phallus and the reign of the phallus is over. And I of course I'm totally against that, and that kind of reading. What inspires me also is Lucie Rigaret, who for example says, okay, language doesn't come with the phallus. It comes already with actually between the child and the mother, long before when the phallus arrives, or the third. The phallus doesn't have to be the father either, or the third, It arrives already between the mother and the child. And another thing that Lucie Rigaret says, which is quite radical actually, is that men, when they walk, they don't speak with their penises, but women actually do. We actually have two, we don't with their penises, but we actually have two lips walking and moving and actually speaking.
Well, we have two balls.
Yeah, but I don't know if they exchange some.
I'm not sure how far we can push this metaphor.
I don't know either. I have to think about that.
I mean, it's obvious, if you look at the French debate, specifically about gender and transgender issues, there's been a lot of pretty reactionary stuff being said by specifically Lacanian psychoanalysts. It's a bit surprising to see them not fall back into this extremely retrograde position. I mean, that must somehow indicate that there is a strong conservative.
Oh, yes. What I'm trying to do is to actually build bridges between all those different schools, because it has exploded once when Lacan died, and it is exploding now because of the new struggles we have in society, and we have to listen to them too in order to transform the discourse.
How do you think this is also something which is occasionally surfaces, but not really thematically? I mean, given the political, you live in Paris, and there's an election coming up, but we have all these horrible racist things going on, and the new right wing people appearing. I don't know. What would you say that? This is of course a very huge question, but what do you think psychoanalysis can contribute to an understanding of those, violent effects and passions that, not just in France, but at this moment particularly in France. What do you think psychoanalysis can somehow contribute to understand the situation?
There are several things. First of all, I think we have to see again the divan and the cabinet as a laboratory for politics. Of course, it's not psychoanalysis can't change the masses, but it can change, or at least help individuals to feel better one by one, un par un. And secondly, I think that we also have to address psychoanalysis in a way that doesn't try to stigmatize those difference as such. Lacan actually did speak about the importance of le sujet divisé, the fact that we are always in conflict with each other, and I think that also other people that are changing identities or are fluid identities, they are more aware of this conflict, inner conflicts, because they're harboring them, they are exposing them. And one thing that it has been forgotten, which is really basic psychoanalysis, is the relation between Eros and Thanatos. We think that it's only outside, but never, very seldom at least, I don't know how it is in Sweden, speak about the Thanatos within us, our wish to destroy the other. And Hegel said it, I mean, n'est-ce pas? And we tend to forget about that and create ideal selves that are rational and good.
I mean, I think in normal political discourse, the acknowledgement of the death drive would be, people would be reluctant to accept it simply because it runs counter to the idea of politics.
I mean, Zemmour would never say, "Oh, I'm sorry, I'm just driven by a death drive. I just want to, because I felt neglected in my childhood." Who never said that?
No.
We never have this self-awareness in politics. But even Chantal Mouffe said it recently to me this summer. She said, and she has also written, and she's writing a new book now coming out with the last chapter about psychoanalysis. And she says that the problem of politicians especially today is that they don't take in consideration psychoanalysis anymore. And if we try to take care of the tools, change them, transform them, we could actually perhaps contribute to the improvement of this situation.
I want to come back to the question of art here, and you begin by the first chapter called Subterranean Consciousness, right? Which is on several things, but
subterranean. I thought you said Mediterranean.
Subterranean.
Subterranean
Subterranean. You quote several things, but also I think most importantly Plato's Republic, the ascent from the cave, and which of course is something which brings, as it were, philosophy close to psychoanalysis, and but you also say it's a tragic description. I mean because. Why?
It's a tragedy.
Why is it a tragedy?
Well, I think the tragedy is not residing in the fact that he discovers that the man discovers that he has lived in a lie, that he has lived in the world of phantasms or simulacra, you would say, perhaps, or Baudrillard would say. But the tragedy resides in the fact, and that he's not capable of, getting out of it with the others. And he has to come back and tell them about what he has said and so on, or seen. Sorry, the tragedy lies in the fact that he hasn't transformed this exit out of the grotto into a collective one, and that he sees also that the exit as the end of the journey. For me, the end of the journey is to actually go from the light to darkness. I think that's where the truth really lies.
He has to go down.
Deeper. So for me, it's just the beginning of a journey, and not a true accomplishment of what it means to actually go and seek truthfulness within the senses, And ever since we have had this division, of course, Aristoteles tries to mend things, but the division between light, truth, and darkness.
I always thought about in specifically in Lacan, he would oppose Plato on that, because I think Plato is, at least in that text, he's fundamentally optimistic, because you can go up to the light, you can see the forms, the ideas, and then go back, and there's a philosopher king who can fix the world. So tragedy is in fact expelled from Plato. I think this is one of the arguments of the Republic, that we don't need tragedy.
No.
But in psychoanalysis there is tragedy, because things cannot be fixed. In that sense, and we have to accept the fact.
Enjoy our symptoms.
You can enjoy
because
symptoms.
If you take away someone's symptom, you take also away sometimes who they are.
Yeah.
And that can create even more trouble.
And how do you place art in that? If we often know that Plato expels the arts and artworks, but if there's a kind of contest between psychoanalysis and philosophy here, one being more optimistic, the other one perhaps not pessimistic, but a bit stoic, you have to endure the facts of life. Where would you place art in that? Is it more close to psychoanalysis or closer to Platonic optimism?
I would say that I'm very hypnotistic about when it comes to affects. I think that there is important to look at les passions joyeuses et les passions tristes, the sad passions and the joyful passions. And I think that there is a lot of joy coming out. Look, for example, at Suran. I don't know, perhaps I'm a little bit deranged, but I have a lot of fun by reading very dark literature, or very fun
he's a pessimist,
looking at apocalyptic art artworks of we have lived in a very apocalyptic era when it comes to the art world. That's been very dark times, you know. But that there's so much joy when you actually contribute to you have the feeling that you can actually contribute to the actually how do you say it in accelerationism, you know, has been very joyful about, you know, distraction, and vice versa. I mean, there is a lot of sadness within joy, or people that try to forget about sadness, you know.
The final chapter, chapter 12, is called the desire for disaster. Desire for disaster. So how what is this desire for disaster?
Well, it's actually a critique, indirect critique of Joseph Campbell, who actually thinks that we need happy endings. And for me, the happiness is not the goal.
No.
La joie, joy is, and you can actually be joyful about every aspect of tragedy from the beginning to the end. Someone said that tragedy, life is a tragedy for those that think, and the comedy for those. Tragedy is a. No, wait a minute, I have to say it in French. La vie est une tragédie pour ceux qui sont, and a comedy for those who think. Yeah. But I think one can actually combine those, not be either or, but both and.
I mean, there's a passage.
A lot of joy in tragedy and disasters.
I was thinking when I read this about that there's this passage in Kant in Critique of Practical Reason, but also in Critique of Judgment, where it says that the goal of creation of the world, or man's moral course throughout the world, is not to become happy, but to become worthy of being happy.
Worthy?
I know, to be able, that's nicht Glückseligkeit, which is like, you know, being happy in a state of bliss, or feeling...
Worthy? That sounds very Lutheran.
Yeah, but I mean...
To deserve it?
Well, to be in the sense of having a moral position on the world.
Yeah.
If that actually makes you happy, that's fine, but it need not make you happy, because you can actually... I was thinking about also this because then coming back to art world, and we're not really able to speak about all the chapters here, but there's a chapter here where you discuss a conflict which you had with the Swedish critic Maria Lind, and she's not here now, so maybe we shouldn't talk about her specifically, but it has to do with the question of ethics in art, and how you somehow negotiate with the devil when you enter into the economic system. And can you describe, I mean, what were the principal features of that discussion?
Well, to be honest, I must say that I've really thought a lot around that conflict we had, because it was a conflict that...
Maybe you can describe the conflict.
Oh yes, of course. It was a conflict that she tried to look upon, because in Sweden we have had a lot of state-funded art, and the state, you know, can't do everything, and she wanted to show also the importance today of private money, and then it's very complex exhibitions, but I'm going to simplify it. Connected herself in order to show how the state money and the private money sometimes intertwine. Is the state money more pure than the private money? Well, in that case, she chose to collaborate with Lundin Oil, who had, contributed to all kinds of suffering in Sudan. And I think that the idea was to do a criticism from the belly of the beast, you know, not see artists or curators as someone would be outside the system, or could criticize it as if they were not part of it. Well, and the discussion or debate or conflict, if you wish, we had was that she thought that one couldn't draw any ethical lines, you know. But I think that when it comes to politics, one has to sometimes to say no to some specific. And she was the first who actually was for strategic separatism. Yeah. And for me, that was a shift, intellectual shift, that also was part of the 90s, when the curators in the 90s try not to be moralistic about stuff, you know, and she kind of followed it too later on. Why did she do it? Well, someone said it was a way to do a Santiago Serra from a curatorial point of view, you know, reproduce a power dysfunctionment in order for us to see it. I don't know. Back then I was quite provoked by it. But some things in the books have changed. I'm more provoked sometimes by things that I wasn't, and I'm less provoked by things that I was. So it's also a way to show how my thinking has changed over the years.
But I think if one thinks about it from this psychoanalytical point of view, there's of course the thing about money, which is there a psychoanalysis, you have to pay the analyst, there's a flow of money between the two, and there's the obviously the connection between excrements and money. But also the problem of fetishism with Freudian. I mean, so I mean,
exactly.
I'm not sure what you think about this, but I mean the extreme intensification of the financial aspects of the art world, today, and the extreme fetishism that even attaches to objects which don't even exist, like non-fungible tokens and stuff. I mean, it's interesting to look at that from a psychoanalytical point of view. And how, what do you think psychoanalysis can show us about this kind of fetishistic structure of the art world?
Well, as I wrote in my book, I think I began, because I try to begin almost every chapter with a personal story that I feel a little bit, ashamed of, because writers, artists work with shame, they have no problem, but theoreticians seldom do, I would say. So a story that I had, that I'm sharing with the reader is that when I started going psychoanalysis, I had a fantasy of not paying, the analyst would say, no, your story is so interesting, you don't have to pay. Also, it's very poor, and then one day when I said to him, this is quite expensive and it costs me a lot and I'm very, very poor. And he said, have you thought about the Merchant of Venice lately? I was like, no. What happens to the Merchant of Venice? Well, he was not a teacher, he was not teaching me often, but he said one thing, that when you don't pay with money, you start paying
with flesh.
Yeah, and it doesn't mean that he prostitutes himself, it means that your body is paying instead. So we all have a symbolic death, debt, not death.
Not death. We have that too.
That was a Freudian slip. Lacanian slip. We all have a debt to pay to someone. So we also have to learn to lose something. So money paying in the art world would be to have to realize that artworks, in order to produce, artists, in order to survive, they have to get paid. In order to create mesmerizing huge installations or whatever, you need money for it. And there has been a very moralistic tendency in the left art world community saying that now it's bad to do art objects to be materialistic. Why should we add another art? And I think that we have to be more dialectical about it.
I mean, you also address the issue of technology in the chapter here, and maybe going off now in a bit different direction, but then maybe not really. I mean, the extreme, as it were, virtualization of economy of the art world, and the emphasis on, as it were, mediation and communication and being as it were present all over the world, seems to me to somehow remove the materiality and the corporeality and the bodily aspect of art, and it seems also to perhaps make psychoanalysis less relevant in the immediate sense, but perhaps more relevant in other sense, because all of this is so much in the imaginary. I mean,
oh yes, perhaps.
How what do you think psychoanalysis can somehow say about this?
Well, that's a very interesting question. I have to think about it. Well, I think first of all, when it comes to the psychonautic journey that a lot of artists do, either through VR or through physical transformation of an art space, for example, Pierre Huyghe, when he recreates almost like imaginary worlds that you wander through it as if you were wandering through a dream, or when you have like artists like Sitzel Mineke Hansen, where you are putting an ocular rift and then you travel through someone's virtual reality. What happens is that we come in the realm of what Lacan would call phantasm, and fantasy is never castrated. And if you're not having castration, you're not either having desire. There's always a death drive within fantasy, and without the cut, without frustration or the, I don't know what do you call it, the cut or the castration, you don't have the beginning of desire. And you know why? You know why?
I know why Lacan, but
of course I know. But it took me a long time to understand why, because I was against castration. I thought, this is only a bunch of men who just want to stop artists, women, revolutionaries to put down. No, it's about creating a border so you can transgress it, actually. And in virtual reality, you seldom have those borders. And if you look today at what Zuckerberg is doing with the metaverse, with the parallel worlds, where will the borders be? Where will castration take place? I don't know.
But I mean, it's all this, of course, imaginary fantasy. It's all about the fantasies about leaving your body or downloading your brain or living in a different world and being transhuman and living forever. But castration will die because you will die.
Sorry?
I mean, your body will die.
Yeah. Oh, the ultimate castration is that we're going to die. Yes, of course.
Because you're finite. And in the end, you take off your helmet and you're there, but your shitty body, bald and impotent and whatever. And it's not going to change, you know. So it's a fantasy of escape. Somehow.
It's a fantasy of escape. Yeah. It's an escape, and I think one shouldn't be moralistic about it. We need to escape sometimes.
Yeah.
But if we look at, for example, at Oscar Wilde, the portrait of Dorian Gray, who tries to escape reality by transforming the world in an artwork, or his own world in an artwork, it's very narcissistic. Yeah. I mean, it's a negation of the other, basically.
But I mean, to say this, you know, as Lacan would say, the real is impossible, le réel c'est impossible. I mean, he said that in different contexts, but I mean, I think some people would say, you know, who would object to psychoanalysis, that this is precisely the problem of art or aesthetic autonomy, that it is. I mean, Lacan has his particular reasons for saying le réel c'est impossible, but you know, since art is somehow placed in the imaginary, it detaches itself from the real, and the real becomes impossible as long as you're in the sphere of aesthetic autonomy. But I don't think you would agree with that. Or how do you see art's engagement with the real in the sense of politics and the real world?
Well, for example, I showed there are several works. For example, Thomas Hirschhorn, he takes the real from an abject point of view when he does, you know, this Crystal Palace, when he shows these images that have been rejected from society of death bodies and so on. He engages with the real. It makes the irrepresentable presentable again, because he introduces this, you know, touch that came in the beginning of 2000. Something like Thomas the doubter, who has to touch the images in order to believe it. It's a way to relate with the real, or the real as an impossible representation with Alfred Aujar, who shows the Rwanda, the people that saw the Rwanda you know, massacre. And there are also artists that take the real as a reality as such, like Anna Odell, and transform it. I mean, the reality of psychosis, if you want, or depression, and showing what had happened by a reenactment. So there are ways to engage with the real, and I think that, well, I would say something that I'm not agreeing with myself, but I'm going to say it anyway. I usually don't like happy endings to stuff, because we consume it and forget about it. But if there would be a happy ending to someone going through analysis, I think it is the embracement of the real, like acceptance of what is there. Yeah. And I think Spinoza would agree with me. I think perhaps you. I don't know what you think about that.
No, but I mean, I sometimes think, you know, the Lacanian equation, the real is impossible. Then you have the graffiti in May '68 in Paris. Be realist, demand the impossible. Soyez réaliste, demandez l'impossible.
Oh wait,
I'm not sure
if
one responds to the others. They probably knew Lacan. I mean, the person who wrote that graffiti must have known Lacan. So I don't know if one objects to the other, but it's an interesting equation. Be realist, demand the impossible.
What does it mean to you? What would you say that this phrase means?
Well,
because it's quite complex.
Yeah, I would say, I'm not sure. I would say it means that it gestures in the direction of utopia. Obviously, I mean, the only realist position, the only position that actually takes a stance in relationship to the real, which is a realist position, always demands the impossible. You have to demand the impossible in order to get into contact with the real.
I totally agree with you.
In a kind of utopian, yes, you know. I'm not. When Lacan said, I don't think he was utopian. He was saying the real is impossible because he was anti-utopian when saying that. But I think there's an utopian energy in that statement.
But you can embrace the impossible.
Yes.
Through be real, demand the impossible.
Be realists.
Be realists. Demand
the impossible.
Well, it's really complex. I think it is possible to demand the impossible and accept that it is impossible, and then it becomes possible. No?
I mean, it has to do with the idea of utopia, obviously, I think, anyway. And there's a long discussion of utopia in your book about I mean, art has, from Adorno and many others, art will have a utopian energy, and I think you also embrace that idea that there is a kind of necessity for utopian thrust in artworks. And,
yes.
What is that utopian thrust?
Well, to begin with, I started to criticize utopias, so-called utopias. Thomas More was not utopic.
No.
You were not allowed to be atheist. You were not allowed to have diverse clothes.
No.
You were not allowed even to leave the island. So that was not so utopian. And then I tried to go to the 90s and try to understand why so many artists were into utopias and created these microverses, which was not far away from Taz, and Hakim Bey, autonomous art zones. Well, they thought, we have to create things at a small scale, micro-utopias, n'est-ce pas? And then they were criticized by people like Claire Bishop, those artists saying, well, they are too angelistic, they are too too utopian. Too utopian utopias. They forgot about what? They forgot about conflict, discursivity, and which is a part of human, So I think that we have to invent utopias that are discursive. And there have been tendencies like Artur Ziemiewski's, the conflict that was between inviting Occupy movement to occupy the biennial and so on. And then I asked him also, because he invited all kinds of people with ideological, quite bizarre statements. I asked him, would you invite Hitler to your utopia? And he said, well, yeah, if he had been alive, I would have invited him also. But that would mean that he would be an artist and not he would have been...
I mean, utopia is, of course, a very conflicted concept, and I think it goes back and forth whether people want utopia or not. But I think the artwork, I would follow Adorno that the artwork has a kind of necessary gesturing somehow towards utopia. Not that it's a concrete thing that we know what it looked like, but it always proposes another world. Another world is always possible. It could be a worse world, of course. But there are also other worlds that exist beyond the one that we... In the real,
like Swan, who created this, almost Radeau de la Méduse, this kind of rafts, micro worlds out of junk, and I mean, of course, she's also pointing to a possible future. They can instruct us in the world to come, and I think that utopias will become important again. They are not so much right now because the younger generations have not so much faith in the future. No. But I think it's...
What do you think? I mean, I think this will be the final question. Or there are philosophers to say we need to, because of the Anthropocene and the global warming, all this situation there is now all over the world. We have to live. We have to learn how to die. We have to accept our finitude. As already Plato said, philosophy is to learn how to die. Is that something that psychoanalysis would? I mean, there's the death drive, and I think there's a tragic dimension in psychoanalysis, but there's also always been curious about the Freudian theory of love, which is a bit underdeveloped in Freud. Maybe you give this quote from Lacan. It says something to the effect that to love someone is to give what you don't have to someone who doesn't want it. It's a very sad story.
Yes.
Story.
I love thinking about this sentence because it doesn't give so much hope.
It doesn't give you a lot of hope.
But it also explains why so many relations don't work, because you give your lack to the other, and the other one doesn't want your lack.
Yeah.
And I think that one has to think about.
It's a very pessimistic claim, isn't it?
Yeah, but I think it makes me joyful about it, because I think that once you understand why it is dysfunctioning, then you can actually change things. Yeah. Like, for example, wanting the lack in the other, even desiring it. Yeah. What lacks do you have today? You can share with me. Perhaps in the future we're going to see the lack as the almost,
But wouldn't you say? Reality. I mean, the way I perceive it is, there's immense, there's a presence of tragedy, infinitude, and acceptance of the intellectual conditions of being alive in psychoanalysis. But there's not a lot of theory of love. I mean, there's a certain positivity lacking. In psychoanalysis, and do you agree with that?
Well, I'm writing the chapter on love and hate. Yeah. I'm going into I write about this film, L'Age de l'Innocence, the Age of Innocence, trying to understand, and I would love to really write a book only about not dysfunctional art works, but love stories, and show why they are so. I mean, even the most beautiful ones are extremely violent.
Yeah.
And Scorsese said this was my most violent film, and there were not people like shooting on each other. There were, and what was the violence in the Age of Innocence? It is that those people. I mean, Archer, when he falls in love with Michelle, he doesn't want what he desires. He doesn't. I mean, that's the basic idea in desire, that we never want what we desire. Once we get it, we don't want it anymore.
No.
And it's also a theory based on, again, lack, and not on what is already there. And I think we have to start to navigate. I mean, learn how to navigate through the lacks of the other. I love my friends for their, not for their qualities. I love them for their
Lacks.
for their lacks.
What is
the opposite of quality of their default? Faults.
But they're faults.
Yeah, and myself, I now, I'm comfortable with my own faults. I think they're much more interesting than my so-called qualities. And I think love can change. We have to, I was going to say something very stupid. Love can change.
No, please.
I think love can change politics if we start looking at the hatred we have within it. So that's why you have to think about hate and love as something that actually comes from the same source, like Eros and Thanatos is the same source of energy. Freud almost, I think, said it, but was not clear enough.
No.
And work with both energies, not say that we are only into one part of it, we're also trying to destroy what we have sometimes. So and I think that artists know that already, because so many artworks are, hovering both positive and destructive energies.
So, I mean, if we speak about love and hatred, specifically how love and hatred and these very strong antagonistic forces enter into the field of politics, we have a phenomenon like terrorism, for instance, which you also discuss in the book. And there are people, who would somehow try to aestheticize this. You mentioned Stockhausen, of course, on 9/11, but also Boris Groys to some extent. And how do you perceive that?
Well, I think that the way romantics idealize the other and seek perfection in the other, and almost Stendhal speaks about crystallization. When you're loving at the beginning, the other one is so fantastic, so wonderful, and so on, and then all of a sudden he disappoints you and becomes le mauvais objet, say the Frenchman, the opposite of it. They are not so far away from terrorists who also divide the world in good and bad guys, in the purity of whether it is left extremist politics or religious fundamentalism, divided also in purity and impure. And I think that one should think and look at how love and terrorism, how romantic people can become almost terrorists on an emotional level, and vice versa. What the terrorists didn't receive in relation to love, from whether it was the mother or the father or the society and so on, and what do they want to obtain? What kind of love, impossible love, do they want to obtain? So for me, those are quite linked, actually.
You think about the French context, this idea of laïcité, the neutrality and universality, and I must say a certain arrogance in some French claims to universality, which obviously provokes a lot of counter-reactions in the French political discourse. I mean, as a psychoanalyst, this must be like a perfect object to analyze how these passions play out in I'm not asking you for a recipe. You mean
right now?
Yeah, what is to be done, or how do you perceive the situation right now? It's a very explosive situation in France.
Oh yes. Well, I think it's very, very important to try to do what Gramsci said. Like, in order to gain power, you have to gain cultural power. You have to colonize the imaginary field, and the imaginary field now is colonized also through culture by people that, from the right-wing extremists, try to say we are free, look at us, we are funnier than you are, we are much more in relation with our desires and so on. So it's a cultural battle. It's not an identitarian battle. I don't like the word ideological conflicts, because when you say that it's an ideological or identitary conflict, we forget about what in ideology there is always a fiction, and it becomes very abstract. And we say it's identity politics, we forget about human rights movements. So when you say, oh, Black Lives Matter, oh, they're into identitarian politics, you forget, no, they're fighting for human rights. So it's a matter of language. They're very manichaeistic in France, but also elsewhere in the world. And we have to say, how do we use words? Almost have like a language course again, but no one wants to be taught. So how can we do it? How can we make discussions about language fun again? I don't know, but it's going to be a heavy battle. And I just heard now, I don't know if it's true, that Welbeck is coming out with a book in January, 700 pages, and we don't know anything about the content of it, but I've heard some rumors, and the ones that give them are quite, they never have, anyway, they know what I'm speaking of. Apparently the book is going to be, there's one person who's going to like it, and it's Zemmour.
Yeah, I mean, that figures.
Yeah, so artists have an important role today because they are the ones who can influence our imaginaries. So.
And Welbeck is an artist. I mean, it's a sense.
In that sense, yeah.
So I mean, artists can play all kinds of roles.
Who goes into the real and influences the real. Yeah. So that's why the artists today have to work on all levels: the imaginary level, the real level, the symbolic order. It's going to be a battle. It has always been, but now perhaps more than ever. Yeah.